Hoje nós vamos receber Scott Ritter, é um dos mais disputados comentaristas de guerra do mundo. Estará conversando conosco pela primeira vez aqui no Brasil. I am Fernando Capez, and with me, Commander Robson Farinazzo. It's really a privilege having you in our show. First time have a conversation with Brazil. Scott Ritter is one of the best experts of the world in geopolitics, war strategy, and foreign policy. Specialist in Middle East, Russia, Eastern Europe, and China. He served for 12 years as United States Marine Intelligence Officer, worked as United Nations Special Commission Weapons Inspector. He was also analyst during the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. He's not just a profound theoretical, but a man with vast experience on the ground. And he wrote the bestseller Endgame, Solving the Iraq Crisis. Põe o livro na tela aí, Alemão. Alemão, Scott, Alemão is the nickname of Mario, our producer. In English, Alemão is German because of his blonde hair and blue eyes. All right, it's not available now because the book is completely sold out. I'm talking about the book, all right, who is sold out, not Alemão, the producer. Scott, we are here because we are not interested in ideology. We are not Putin, Zelensky, Biden, or Trump supporters. We want nothing but facts. We want evidence, just the truth. That's why it's a unique opportunity to have you with us, with the most reliable source directly from the ground. I'll make a question about the proxy war in Ukraine, and Commander Farinazzo will ask you about Middle East. So, Scott, let's go. My question. In your opinion, which are the recent roots of the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Tell us about the NATO expansion in 1999, 2004, and 2008. About the coup d'etat in 2013, the Crimea invasion with the, quote, little green, unquote, the little green, unquote, until the February 2022 invasion. How this war will end? And what's the real risk of a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia? And how is the present military capability of United States? Please, we all want to listen to you, Scott Ritter.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very extensive, broad question, but it's always good to start at the beginning. This conflict, the current conflict in Ukraine, did not begin on February 24th. Yes, that's of 2022. That's when Vladimir Putin ordered Russian forces into Ukraine. But if you listen to the speeches that he gave prior to initiating that order, he talked about what had been a buildup of justification. First of all, 8 years of incessant bombardment of civilian populations in Donetsk and the Donbass by the Ukrainian forces. It had killed thousands, including hundreds of children. But that bombardment in and of itself is not the only reason. That bombardment came about because of what happened in 2014, a coup d'etat that was conducted in Kiev, the Maidan, they call it. But this coup d'etat was carried out under the instructions of the CIA, the United States government, together with the European Union, designed to overthrow a democratically elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. They threw him out of power, replaced him with a nationalist government handpicked by the United States. And that's what we have to understand. Because of this coup, these nationalists came into being. They immediately started carrying out a program of ethnic and cultural genocide against the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine, primarily located in the eastern section. They tried to take over Crimea, but the Russian government intervened. You talked about little green men. the Russian government is a government that operates very much under the rule of law. And it's impossible for the Russian president to order Russian troops to go into the territory of a foreign country without the permission of the Russian parliament. And so, confronted with the fact that these Ukrainian nationalists, many of whom have embraced the ideology of a gentleman named Stepan Bandera. He is a Ukrainian nationalist from the 1930s and 40s who fought alongside Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, participated in the murder of tens of thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Polish civilians, hundreds of thousands of Russian civilians. He is considered by these nationalists to be the hero of Ukraine, and they have embraced his hate-filled ideology and were seeking to continue the purges that he encouraged on the Russian population of Crimea. This was an imminent threat, so the way that Russia responded to it was to mobilize militias, forces that didn't have official affiliation with the Russian government, but were responding to the orders of the Russian government. These are the little green men, Russian special forces, Russian intelligence forces. Some of them were organized into distinct units. One of these units was known as Wagner, named after a former Russian intelligence officer who used the call sign Wagner. And they helped take control of Crimea together with the Crimean Russians, and Russia annexed Crimea, brought it into its power to keep it from falling in the hands of these nationalists. These nationalists then turned on Odessa. They participated in a riot that resulted in, 48 Russians being burned to death in a building. They then went to Mariupol in the Donbass and started to, move to take that over. And the Russian population of the Donbass stood up and said, enough is enough. And they began a resistance movement to these nationalists that became the current, conflict that we see today, the conflict in the Donbass, which led to Russian intervention. But even that's not the beginning of the fight. You see, why was Russia worried about this Ukrainian government? It's not just about the bombardment of the citizens of Donbass. Russia had agreed to a peace process in the aftermath of the 2014 coup d'etat known as the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords were designed to encourage a ceasefire and to encourage a peaceful resolution to the issue by having the Ukrainian government change its constitution, change its laws so that Russian language, culture were protected. They weren't going to be persecuted. In exchange for this, Russia would respect the borders of Ukraine, meaning that Russia had no territorial aspirations on Ukraine. And for 8 years, Russia worked to see the Minsk Accords implemented. The Minsk Accords were a byproduct of a negotiation that took place between Ukraine, France, and Germany. France and Germany were supposed to put pressure on Ukraine to implement the Minsk Accords. We now know that both France and Germany, together with Ukraine, viewed the Minsk Accords as a fraud, as a sham. They were designed to fool the Russians into allowing for a ceasefire under the promise of a peaceful resolution, but all the while, it was designed to buy time so that NATO could train a Ukrainian army capable of defeating the separatists in the Donbass and defeating the Russian army. And the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, has admitted this. The President of France at the time, François Hollande, has admitted this, that this was a sham. The President of Ukraine at the time, Petro Poroshenko, has likewise said this was a sham. So the important thing about this is that for 8 years, from 2014 to 2022, Russia was seeking a peaceful resolution to this problem based upon diplomacy. It was France, Germany, Ukraine, the United States, and NATO that were using false diplomacy to buy time to build up a Ukrainian military that could threaten the Donbass with military force. Russia cited this threat as the imminent danger that necessitated its intervention. But even it's bigger than this, because we have to go backwards even further to 2008. In 2008, at that time, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, a guy named William Burns, today he's the CIA director, but at that time he was the ambassador, he wrote a memorandum in early 2008 that talked about NATO expansion. He said if NATO seeks to expand into Ukraine, this is a red line for Russia, and Russia would intervene militarily, and there would be a war in Ukraine if NATO expands into Ukraine. So clearly what he's saying is there's a known cause and effect relationship, that if NATO seeks to expand into Ukraine, NATO knows that this will provoke Russia to the extent that Russia will eventually militarily intervene. And yet, in late 2008, NATO invited Ukraine to join its ranks, meaning that NATO made a deliberate decision to invite Ukraine knowing that it would lead to a situation where Russia would eventually use military force. NATO deliberately provoked Russia to start a war. It's always been NATO's objective to have a military conflict with Russia over Ukraine. Now, this objective didn't start in 2008, though. It goes back to the decision to expand NATO that was made in the early 1990s at the end of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, 1992. Prior to that, the Berlin Wall, which divided East and West Berlin, part of the occupation of Germany that took place after World War II, part of the division of Europe into East and West blocs, NATO, Warsaw Pact, the Berlin Wall fell down. That meant that Germany was going to be unified. The Soviets, who occupied Eastern Germany, had around 400,000 troops there, and their leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, said, we are hesitant to withdraw our troops because we don't have a peace treaty with Germany. We don't know what's going to happen when Germany unifies, and we don't want a unified Germany to be part of NATO. We don't want NATO forces to be expanding. And he was promised by the United States, by Europe, by others, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. And based upon that promise, he withdrew Soviet troops from Germany, allowing German reunification. But immediately, NATO reneged on its promise. It began a policy of expansion. Why? Because NATO wanted to ensure that Russia could never again emerge from the ashes of the Soviet Union to threaten NATO, the United States, with its power. Russia's a very large nation with massive resources, and Russia, if it ever got its act together, would be able to compete against the United States and NATO economically and geopolitically, and the goal was to prevent this. It wasn't just the expansion of NATO. The entire decade of the 1990s was premised on the West exploiting Russia, dominated it politically. You remember in 2016, people talked about how Russia interfered in the American election, the presidential election. It turns out that none of that was true. But in 1996, the United States bought a presidential election in Russia, the re-election of Boris Yeltsin. We bought it. We bragged about it. Time magazine ran a cover story about this. We were trying to dominate Russia politically for the same reason, to keep Russia weak. We were trying to dominate Russia economically. We went in there and we literally stole hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian wealth, and we created the conditions that Russia would be permanently economically weakened. Anybody who knows anything about Russia knows that the decade of the 1990s were one of the worst moments in Russian history, as bad as the end of the Second World War and the situation that existed there. Millions of Russians lost their lives because of this, through alcoholism, through suicide, just through the overall depression that set in on a nation. This was a deliberate act by the United States, by Europe, to weaken Russia. When Boris Yeltsin stepped aside in 1999, Vladimir Putin took over. And we were hoping that we could capture him like we captured Boris Yeltsin, but that didn't work. Vladimir Putin instead went on the path of rebuilding Russia. And the resentment that exists in the United States and Europe to Vladimir Putin for not continuing the policy of surrender that Yeltsin had bought into, that Vladimir Putin had the audacity to make Russia great again, to rebuild the Russian economy, to allow Russia to stand up, to rebuild the Russian military, so there was no longer this weak force. This is what led to not only the continued expansion of NATO to weaken Russia, but led to the events of Maidan in 2014 and the events of what's going on today. What's going on today in Ukraine is part of what we call a regime change operation overseen by the United States, not to change the regime in Ukraine, although that's what we did, but to use the crisis of Ukraine to bring down Vladimir Putin. This war that we're engaged in is a war that isn't just about the military on the ground. There was an important component of this, the economic component, the economic sanctions that were imposed on Russia. These sanctions were supposed to destroy the Russian economy, to collapse the Russian economy, and to create a domestic political crisis in Russia that would allow the people to hold their own Maidan revolution in Moscow to get rid of Vladimir Putin. The war on the ground was just seen as a way of putting additional pressure on Russia. Unfortunately for the West, the Russian economy was able to ride out the sanctions and actually increase the size of the Russian economy and turn the sanction damage back on Europe, which is suffering greatly today. And the Russian military has been able to defeat the collective strength of NATO, the United States, hundreds of billions of dollars of equipment to stymie a Ukrainian military and now destroy a Ukrainian military. They've turned around, but the important takeaway here is that the policy of the United States has been, for many years now, since the end of the Cold War, regime change in Russia, the destruction of Russia, the weakening of Russia. And that's what this conflict in Ukraine is an extension of. It's an extension of that policy to destroy Russia.
Scott, why did the Russian army acted so poorly in the beginning of the invasion? What's the role of Boris Johnson avoiding a peaceful understanding between Zelensky and Putin in March 2022? I want to comment this. What about biological labs in the boundary with Russia? Just it shortly, please.
Sure. Well, first of all, when you say, why did the Russian army perform poorly? What makes you think the Russian army performed poorly? The goal of the Russian military, this is a special military operation. It's not a war. The goal of the Russian military was not to destroy Ukraine or to occupy Kiev. The goal of the Russian military was to put pressure on the Ukrainian government so that they would negotiate a peaceful outcome that would prevent the state of conflict between Ukraine and Russia, ensure that Ukraine never again would consider joining NATO. That was the goal. Within a week of the Russian incursion into Ukraine, the Ukrainians started negotiating. They did 3 negotiations at Gomel in Belarus. The negotiations then transferred to Turkey, and an interim agreement had been reached between Ukraine and Russia by the end of March, which would have brought an end to the conflict. Ukraine was going to agree to the Russian conditions that they would not join NATO. In exchange for that, Russia would withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Russia would work with Ukraine to come up with a solution to the Donbass. Russia was not going to take control of the Donbass. There would be international referendums. This would have been the best deal possible for Ukraine. There would have been security guarantees outside of the framework of NATO for the security, regional security of Ukraine. This was signed in a document that had been initialed by the Ukrainian negotiating team and the Russian negotiating team. There was supposed to be a meeting in Istanbul where they would sign this and the war would have come to an end. Understand what I'm saying. Russia's military action in Ukraine was designed to get Ukraine to go to the negotiating table so that this war could be finished as quick as possible, and achieve a genuine, lasting peace. The Russian military succeeded in this. So you can't say that the Russian military performed poorly. They did the job they were tasked to do, and they succeeded. It was the intervention by Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, on behalf of NATO and the United States. He came in and he said, we can't support this. We need you to reject that peace. We need you to move forward. Why did he say that? Because the West misinterpreted Russia's limited response as a sign of weakness. The West told Ukraine that it can continue to provide tremendous amounts of military equipment that would allow Ukraine to do the job they wanted to do prior to the Russian intervention, to militarily recapture the Donbass. And so Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, agreed to this. He dismissed the peace plan, and instead we got onto this path of war, where $100 billion worth of equipment was transferred. The Ukrainian army was rebuilt. And notice what I'm saying. The Ukrainian army was rebuilt. You don't rebuild a victorious military. The military that won the initial phase of the conflict was the Russian military. They suffered casualties. All militaries do. Remember, they hadn't fought a war like this ever. And this current Russian military, there were a lot of mistakes made. There were a lot of lessons that needed to be learned, but they, by and large, destroyed the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian military had to receive $45 billion of military assistance, equipment, training, etc., to rebuild their military, that then carried out a counteroffensive in the late summer, early fall of 2022 that recaptured some of the territory that Russia had occupied. The Russian army at that time was taken aback. They had to fall back. They had to regroup. That's a different question. But the point is, the Russian army didn't perform poorly. They weren't beaten. They did the job they were supposed to do. And had Ukraine agreed to this peace plan, everything would have been fine. It was the intervention of the collective West by pouring in 45, 50, 60, 80, now $130 billion worth of assistance, military and financial assistance, that kept Ukraine in the fight. And Russia's had to adapt to this new reality, had to mobilize troops, had to retrain their military, reconfigure their military. But the point is, today, they're prevailing on the battlefield. Now, you asked a question about biological labs. In Ukraine, the United States, through its threat cooperation, policies, was working with the Ukrainian government to bring Soviet-era biological weapons laboratories under control. One of the key aspects of this is what we would call employment guarantees. You don't want scientists who know how to make biological weapons become unemployed, because they will go elsewhere and seek jobs, and they could transfer that knowledge. So you need the scientists to stay in Ukraine. And part of this goal was to create new opportunities for them to continue doing their work within, hopefully, the framework of the Biological Weapons Convention. The United States, this turned into a massive program, and we don't know exactly. I think the Russians have taken some documents, and their interpretation of the documents is that the United States was using Ukraine as a front for offensive biological weapons activity. I can't say that that's what happened. I know a lot of the people that were involved in this program. These aren't war criminals. I would say that this was a program that was expansive in its approach to building capabilities, that these capabilities would come up close to the edge of the treaty. The United States always believes that it has a right to pursue defensive biological weapons programs, but in order to have a good defensive biological weapons program, you have to have an understanding of the potential threats that exist. And so the United States has historically produced small batches of biological pathogens that we then learn how to protect ourselves against. It seems to me that Ukraine was involved in this kind of operation. It looks bad on paper, and maybe it's bad in reality. What's important here is that the United States needs to be honest about what it was doing. It needs to answer questions about what its goals and objectives were. It needs to talk about the concerns that Russia has put forward. But so far, the United States refuses to do that, and its refusal is seen by many as an admission of guilt.
Scott, since the beginning of this year, 2023, you have been saying that the counteroffensive of Ukraine would fail. How did you know it? How did you know when we have the support of United States and NATO to Ukraine?
It's a question of basic military math. First of all, you don't broadcast your intent. I think my fellow Marine will say that anytime you tell your enemy what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, when you're going to do it, and with what you're going to do it with, you lose all initiative, you lose all advantage. In the fall of 2022, General Zaluzhny was saying to the press that Ukraine was going to carry out a major counteroffensive, that the goal of the counteroffensive was to sever the land bridge between Crimea and Russia. That meant that they were going to seek to capture the city of Melitopol in Zaporizhia. But to do that, he needed to train up an army of 60 to 90,000 men, 9 to 12 brigades. He needed the West to provide him with 300 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 artillery pieces, unlimited ammunition. So he broadcast, the size of his force, where he's going to do it. And what Russia did is they built a defensive belt designed to absorb this attack. It was obvious that this attack was going to fail because you can't broadcast your intent to do this. Also, the Ukrainians were struggling to build up a military force of 90,000. Russia just mobilized 300,000. They were training them. They had another 300,000 volunteers come in. They were training them. The Russian resources were massive compared to the limited resources of Ukrainian. Basic military math dictates that when you get involved in a conflict of attrition, if your burn rate for your forces is higher than your ability to replace, you're going to lose that fight. The burn rate was always going to be very high. Ukraine had very limited ability to replace the casualties that it was going to suffer. Russia, on the other hand, had tremendous ability to replace casualties. Russia had created an algorithm of conflict that had Russia inflicting 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times the casualty rate of Ukraine, meaning that for every Russian that was killed on the battlefield, Russia was killing 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Ukrainians. This is an unsustainable, exchange ratio. So basic military math told you early on that Ukraine was not going to win. One of the key indicators was artillery ammunition. Russia has a superiority in the number of artillery tubes. Ukraine tried to offset this by bringing in Western artillery that had a high rate of fire, good accuracy, but they needed the ammunition to do that. Ukraine was burning through ammunition at a rate far greater than the West could replenish, and it became obvious that Ukraine was going to start running out of ammunition sometime in the summer, at the very moment they needed this artillery for their counteroffensive. So any military analyst, when looking at the totality of the data, should be able to predict that Ukraine was going to lose its counteroffensive.
Now we have your Brazilian Mariner colleague, Commander Robson Farinazzo. He has the word.
Hi, Scott. Scott, from marine to other, based in your enormous experience as an elite soldier and intelligence officer and inspector of weapons of mass destruction, what is your opinion about the new developments? Do you believe Iran will use their Shia militia in Iraq Syria, Lebanon, to strike Israel? And what will be the position of the United States? They will attack Iran. Iran can count with the support of China and Russia. What is your opinion? How do you see all these things, the future development of this crisis?
Well, let's start off with what happened on October 7th of last month. The Hamas attack against Israel, I believe, was a Hamas-only event. And what I mean by that is, contrary to the allegations made by the United States and Israel, neither Hezbollah nor Iran were aware of this. I believe that the Hamas action took both Hezbollah and Iran by surprise. What's important to point that out? The trajectory that both Hezbollah and Iran were on was not one of seeking confrontation with Israel, but rather trying to normalize relations. And, Hezbollah was in the business of governing. They play an important role in the Lebanese parliament. Lebanon is a nation undergoing tremendous economic difficulty, political crisis, and Hezbollah is involved in problem solving in Lebanon, not creating new problems. Any conflict, a large conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, will result in the destruction of a large part of Lebanon, the last thing Lebanon needs. So Hezbollah was moving on a trajectory away from confrontation. The same with Iran. Iran was, basically trying to normalize relations with the United States through this compromise on the nuclear program, the unfreezing of $6 billion worth of Iranian assets that had been illegally seized by the United States. Iran had joined BRICS, the economic forum. Brazil's an important member of that. Iran had joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran was on a trajectory of trying to emerge from decades of sanctions to become economically engaged with the rest of the world, in particular the East. The last thing Iran wants is a military conflict with the United States. Iran had just allowed China to broker peace between it and Saudi Arabia. This was the trajectory they were on. And so now the Hamas movement comes up, the Hamas attack, and the issue of Palestine reemerges. Again, prior to what happened on October 7th, the trajectory of Israeli-Arab relations was one of conformity with the goals and objectives of the Abraham Accord, normalization of relations between Israel, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the Gulf Arab nations. Had this normalization taken place, then there would be no chance whatsoever for a Palestinian state. This is one of the reasons why I think Hamas attacked when it did. Because by attacking Israel, provoking an Israeli over-response, by having the Palestinian people be bombed by the Israelis, a predictable outcome, the issue now of Palestinian statehood is on the front burner everywhere in the world. This is the objective of Hamas. Hamas is not looking for the destruction of Israel. Hamas is looking to politically defeat Israel so that Israel will have to accept a Palestinian state. So Hamas doesn't need Hezbollah to intervene. It doesn't need Iran to intervene. The problem for Hezbollah and Iran is that politically they have made a lot of rhetoric about how they support Palestine, how they support the Palestinian people, how they support Hamas, how they believe that the Al-Aqsa Mosque must be a place where Muslims can practice worshiping their faith without fear of intervention by Israel. Israel's actions have made it very difficult for Hezbollah and Iran to ignore what's happening. So Hezbollah is engaged in a process of controlled escalation where they are attacking the Israelis. The Israelis are attacking them. It's done, though, in a way that doesn't allow it to explode into total violence. Iran is the same. They know they can't stop the militias, the pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and Syria from expressing their outrage. So they are enabling these people to attack American bases, and the United States is receiving these attacks and responding in a limited fashion. All sides are engaged in this very careful dance of escalation management, where you get to blow off some steam, but you don't allow the vessel to overpressure and blow up. And I think that's the direction we're heading. I don't think, well, we'll find out. On Friday is a very important speech given by Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. He could order a general attack on Israel. Let's put it this way. Israel's never been more weak than it is today. If there was ever a time for Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran to come together to strategically defeat Israel, militarily defeat them, now's the time. From a purely military standpoint, if Hezbollah initiated a large-scale attack on Israel, there's nothing Israel can do to stop this attack. Israel doesn't have the military strength to stop it. If Iran threw in its weight behind Hezbollah, likewise, Israel would be destroyed. The United States, has positioned aircraft carriers, 2,000 Marines, etc. That's not sufficient force to deter Iran or Hezbollah. It's a show of force. It's done for political reasons. But to defeat Iran, the United States would need 900,000 troops, the vast majority of its air force, deployed into a region where it won't have free access to air bases or port facilities. Iran will be able to interdict. It's a war that would take years to unfold. And there's no guarantee the United States would win. So the United States isn't looking for a fight. Iran's not looking for a fight. Hezbollah's not looking for a fight. The fight came to them by Hamas's action and Israel's overreaction. And I believe that we're going to see this very dangerous game of escalation management. And I say dangerous because all it takes is one mistake, one miscalculation to have something you think is controlled blow out of control, and suddenly you find yourself in a regional war. And it's a regional war, as you said, could go global. If the United States were to attack Iran with sufficient power, China has indicated that it will support the security of Iran. That could lead to conflicts between China and the United States in the South China Sea. It could lead to Russia intervening on behalf of Iran. Russia and Iran have a new close relationship. Russia backing China up. They have a strategic understanding. This war could become a global conflict with the real potential of nuclear weapons being used. So it's a very, very dangerous situation. I think everybody involved understands the danger here. And understand this. Hezbollah had a statement yesterday that they said they probably won't intervene unless Hamas is on the verge of destruction. And Hamas has made it clear that this battle is going exactly the way they want it to go, that they're comfortable with things. They don't need people to intervene, that they are confident in their ability to defeat the Israeli military in Gaza today. So I think that's where we're at, a very dangerous game of escalation management.
Yes. Scott, the United States doesn't have supersonic missiles. The project is not going very well. The F-35 Lightning II is a box of problems. The USS Zumwalt, you know the history. And the LCS, little crappy ship, that's another fail. What is happening? And they don't have sufficient artillery ammunition to give to the Ukrainians. What is happening with the military industry of the United States of America?
Well, the military industry of the United States of America has forgotten that its primary mission is to keep America strong. Instead, their primary mission has become to make money. If you take a look at how we do weapons procurement in the United States and compare and contrast that with Russia, to give you an example, when this military conflict in Ukraine started, Russia had, certain air defense capabilities. As Ukraine received Western technology, standoff missiles, etc., the problem for Russia came, how do we get our anti-air capabilities to extend into the depth of Ukraine to eliminate these long-range launch platforms. Russia, within the span of a few hundred days, conceived a solution to a problem, built the weapon, designed the weapon, built the weapon, deployed the weapon, and they're now shooting down the Ukrainian airplanes within a couple hundred days. That's how defense industry is supposed to work. In the United States, it would take us 10 to 15 years to do this, because the way defense industry works is that they put out a proposal, they bid low on the proposal, they get the funding for the proposal, and then they drag it out. They need to put on new additions to it, because if you wait 3 years, technology is advanced, and you can't build a system that has old technology. You have to incorporate the new technology. You lengthen the contract, you put it. This is what happened to the F-35. It's a plane that just was designed to do everything. It's a mishmash of technologies, a mishmash of missions, and as a result, it doesn't work. Almost every new weapon system the United States deploys today doesn't work, because it's built not for the purpose of protecting America, it's built for the purpose of enriching the military-industrial complex. And that's where we're at. And we've done this at the sacrifice of the troops on the ground. When I was in the Marine Corps back in the 1980s, we were training to fight the Soviet threat. I would spend over 200 days, sometimes 220 days a year in the field with my artillery battalion doing live fire training, maneuvering, shooting, practicing full time to perfect the skill set necessary to wage conflict against the Russians. This was a very expensive proposition, but it's one we had to do to be considered the best in the world. The title doesn't come free. You have to earn the title. And we earned the title by being in the field, by training constantly. Today, no American military, conventional military force trains anywhere near the level that we trained back in the 1980s. Training has been reduced. Not only that, but we've forgotten how to fight large-scale ground combat. That's what I trained to do exclusively. Because of the global war on terror that after 9/11, the U.S. military became focused singularly on low-intensity conflict, on counterterrorism operations. We forgot how to do tank warfare. We forgot how to do large-scale artillery warfare. We forgot how to do close air support in a contested airspace with suppression of enemy air defense as a primary mission. Instead, we were used to flying over Afghanistan and Iraq, uncontested airspace where everything worked perfectly. There was no electronic warfare jamming our signals, etc. We forgot how to fight war. And now that we've transitioned back to where we need to fight war, we're not prepared to fight war. It costs a lot of money to rebuild this capability, not just in terms of training, but the new equipment necessary, new organizational structures, etc. And here's the big problem. The American people have lost the enthusiasm for waging war. The U.S. Army, to maintain its force structure today, needs to recruit 60,000 troops a year. Last year, they fell 15,000 short of this goal. That's a lot of people. That's a division and a half worth of troops that we didn't recruit, which means there are organizations in the U.S. Army that aren't getting the manpower they need to do their job. So we've further weakened that aspect of the military. You had a think tank come out, a congressional-related think tank, publish a report that said the United States needs to be prepared to fight and win 2 large wars at the same time. Right now, to be honest, we can't fight and win 1 large war at the same time. We don't have enough troops. They're not organized properly, etc. We've spread ourselves too thin so that we no longer can do the kind of fighting we were ready to do back in the 1980s. Back then, we had 300,000 troops permanently stationed in Europe. We could fly in within a span of 10 days, another 300,000. That would fall in on equipment and be ready to fight instantly. We don't do that today. We had 60,000. We now have 100,000. We can't logistically support them in Europe. In the Pacific, we don't have the force structure identified or the capacity to deploy them rapidly. In the Middle East, we can't send 100,000 troops to the Middle East anymore. We just lack this capacity. So they say we have to rebuild our forces. This is going to require another 150 to 200,000 troops at a time when the Army can't meet a 60,000 recruiting objective. The U.S. military is fundamentally broken right now, fundamentally broken, and we already spend $800 billion a year to have this fundamentally broken system. To fix this system would cost even more money, and there are budgetary realities to this. Our way of fighting has become too expensive, and it's not a good way of fighting. We are the most expensive paper tiger the world has ever seen.
Well, these are very concerning informations, especially because they are not ideological or political opinions, but technical, operational comments. I would like to thank you very, very much for your time, your knowledge, your information, and I'm just curious about one thing. I did not listen to your dog barking during the interview. What's happening to him?
1, 2, 3. Fortunately, the mailman didn't come to the door, or the FedEx delivery man, or something. The cat, I got rid of the cat before the interview, so the dogs are all calm right now. But believe me, if 5 minutes from now, that might be a totally different situation.
So and I will visit you and know your dog. Thank you very much. See you next time.